Okay. All right, we got 20 minutes, so we're gonna plow through some slides, and then the best part, I think, it will be the end when my panel of experts will be answering your questions. So think of questions. My name is James Paxton. I am from Wayne State University, and on behalf of our group here, I would like to go ahead and get started with these slides. And this is our didactic team. You'll notice that Liz is, as a presenter, she had a conflict, unfortunately, but she's here in spirit. And this is the rest of our group here. So Liz, Elizabeth Goldberg, myself, James Paxton, Rochelle Cooper, Stephanie Strover, Lynn Ropolo, Peter Howe, Dan Mayer, Andrew Meltzer, Mike Gottlieb. So you might recognize some faces there at the front of the room. These are our disclosures. We got a lot of stuff on there, I guess, but that's us. And so what are our objectives? Yeah, we got a lot. By the conclusion of this session, we hope that the participants will be able to describe the pros and cons of doing a chart review study, describe the steps involved, find some strategies to minimize bias, which is a huge part of that, and review. This is going to be on your own time, sorry, because we got 20 minutes, but we do provide some samples of some case reports, medical record review studies that you guys can look at, and you can practice these skills. So what are chart review studies? I'm guessing most of you have at least seen or read or been involved in a chart review study. What are they good for? I mean, the bottom line is this is how a lot of research gets started, right, is with retrospective data. And you can't really have high-quality prospective studies without starting somewhere, and this is where you start. So it's a fairly low bar in terms of actually doing these studies. Unfortunately, there's a relatively high bar to do them well. And so what we're going to describe for you are some ways to do them well, and give you some resources and some references on that. Some things to consider are the amount of time that's required, okay? And depending on your data source, they can be time-consuming. This may be a first exposure to research for a lot of people, and in fact, I think it often is. Residents and med students, this is sometimes what they get started working on. But it's relatively low risk and potentially high reward, depending on what your study is about and where you're going to publish it. So it is a large number, a large proportion of the research that is published in our specialty. About 25% is the citation of all scientific studies published in emergency medicine journals that are peer-reviewed are chart review studies. And the nice thing is the data is already present. We already have the data. But unfortunately, the data has not really been created or curated for research purposes, right? So we have to try to find ways to mitigate that fact as we go forward in our data assessment and analysis. There's a really great article by the late, great Dr. Kaji, and this is the reference for this. And we're going to talk a little bit about this later. The point of this is that there is something that I don't know if they invented and coined the term, perhaps that was the case, but the retrospective scope is a way of viewing these different lenses, these factors that influence bias and I guess accuracy in these type of studies. And the idea is that it's kind of like that game we might have played as a kid, the telephone game where you tell your neighbor something and they tell the neighbor something and it goes all around the circle and it comes back and you see what kind of weird distorted message came across. And the idea is similar to that each of these lenses has a chance to change or bias the result of the study. And we'll get into some of these specific lenses as we go forward. So I mentioned that EHRs are really not made for research. And partly that's because not all the data sources are really truly objective. A lot of times we're collecting subjective data. And how a measurement was made could change the value that you need. So it's really difficult sometimes to assess that in your studies. There's a potential for data inconsistency as a result. And that's something that's difficult to overcome. So one of the perhaps earliest and certainly most cited articles that you'll find in this topic on chart review methods papers is Gilbert and Lowenstein. And I can remember submitting these studies for publication, and this is the first question they ask. Well, did you use the methods as outlined in Gilbert and Lowenstein? So it's a very big deal in this area. And we're going to talk about the 8 criteria or characteristics that they have defined as representing high-quality chart review. And I hope you guys can read that. I know there's a lot of words on there, but what I want to point out with this is that the 8 things here are what I would consider basic standard things that everybody would agree are really high priority for these studies. One is training, and this primarily refers to abstractors who are performing the job of collecting the data. Case selection, so that could be viewed as inclusion criteria, if you want. The definition of variables, so how are you defining your important variables in your study? And the forms that you're using, you want to use standardized forms to guide your data collection, case report forms. Meetings is important so that everybody on the team is kind of up to date and up to speed. Monitoring should be done, especially this is referring to the chart abstractors, that there's some predefined technique that you're going to use to monitor them. Blinding, very important to reduce bias in most cases. And then the testing of inter-rater agreement, which I think is something a lot of people miss. A lot of people forget this part. So that's an important way to assess the risk of bias in your study. You have a second reviewer re-abstract a sample of charts, and you compare the result that person found to what your abstractors found. Okay, and that's something that you can assess and address at your meetings. You can discuss how you're doing, and you can have an objective way of assessing how well you're doing. So another article that came out more recently, 2005, is Worcester, and this actually expanded this 8 is great to 12. So 12 is better if 8 is great. And they added 4 new things, which are not entirely new, but they're good points to make. The ones that are highlighted at the bottom are the ones that we're drawing attention to here. One of them was the medical record database identified or described. And this is kind of like a checklist that you might go through to assess how well someone has reported their results. But it can be used in designing a study as well, it should be. A sampling method was the method of sampling described, because that's something often is overlooked. Missing data plan, this is huge, right? Because I mentioned that EMRs are not really built for research, and so there's a lot of times there's data that are missing. And so how are you going to handle that? You really should define that a priori before you go in to do the study and have a plan. And then when you publish your results, you should describe your plan and how you plan to assess or deal with missing data. And then IRB, I think that's commonly understood that that's important to mention that when you're reporting your results. I mentioned before the Kaji study, which is a little over 10 years old since it's been published now. And there were some very good pitfalls and solutions that are described in there, and I want to share those with you and highlight some specific ones here. Some of the pitfalls I mentioned earlier is that it's really not, sometimes it's not the right design choice. Sometimes the data that we have are either conflicting or absent. And we may not have a good way established to check for reliability and deal with missing data. Some of the solutions would be to estimate cases, calculate the sample size a priori, which I think is always valuable to do that ahead of time, and deal with conflicts of interest right away. Have a flow diagram, pilot the data collection form is important. I think it's important to consider how many mistakes we can make while having a poorly designed data collection form, right? And so you don't want to go back and recollect the data again. So it's a good idea sometimes, I would say, to pilot that, collect on a small sample of patients before you go proceed with your larger study. And then I mentioned earlier the importance of having regular meetings with your team. We do have some chart review studies that we are going to give you a link to, and you will have access to this slideshow on the SAEM website, so please don't worry if you don't have if you're not fast enough on the draw with your phone. But what we're doing here is we're giving you some example articles, and then we've gone through each of the 12 metrics, and we've given you our answer as to whether they are good enough or not good enough. Hopefully you'll match up with what we decided. And if not, we'd love to hear how we differ. But at the end of the day, there are some common themes that you'll find, and we hope that you will enjoy going through those on your own time. This is the QR code for those articles. We've included all the landmark articles that I mentioned in this presentation and also these sample articles, so hopefully the whole package is there for you. And we'd be glad at this time, if we have time left over, to answer some questions.
We've got a few minutes.
Excellent. So there's my impeccable panel of experts over here. And I see a hand. Yes.
Quick question. So you have 12 elements, right? How many, the ideal would be, hey, let's go for the 12, make sure that we're able to hit all of them. Do you have a sense of a threshold where you're hitting, at an absolute minimum, if you want to go for a JAMA, what have you, this is the number that you have to hit. And I do recognize that they bring different value, but as we're just trying to assess the different data sources that we have and the compromises we have to make, is there such a number?
In an answer, no. But and several of us are decision editors at journals, and we look for some description of your methodology. I think as we move forward, we're going to expect more, because this is something Gilbert and Lowenstein was published in 1996. And most people didn't really pay much attention to it. And certainly most journals didn't try and hold their authors' feet to the fire on describing every element. Until the last, I'm going to say like 5 or 6 years, that we've started at least saying you have to acknowledge that you did some of these things. But there's not a magic number. And some of them are more difficult. You know, getting IRB approval for a retrospective study is more likely than not going to either be exempt or, what's the other
Expedited.
term? Expedited, thank you.
One or the other.
And that's not a big deal. And you just put this one sentence, yeah, we expedited a review given by such and such IRB. Whereas others, like blinding whomever you're going to blind, and you might talk about that too, is a much bigger deal, and you probably ought to describe the process that you used to ensure that they were blinded. And anybody want to talk about blinding?
Yeah, I think I would, at the very minimum, make sure you've addressed these issues, even if you haven't been able to incorporate them into your study design. I'm sorry if I'm stealing it.
No. I'm glad you said that. I just want to add one quick thing. Address it, when James says address it, what that means is in your limitations section, and I can't emphasize this enough, I don't care if your study was only done on people who lived in the south side of such and such a beach. What I do care about is about how you think the lack of blinding might have affected your study. In other words, lack of blinding is going to introduce bias, and you have a duty, you have an obligation to let us know and your readers know that how that might affect it. You know, well, they may have interpreted things in one direction more than the other, something in that nature. Now I'll let you guys talk about how to do blinding.
Well, for blinding for retrospective chart review is something that would be impossible to do, and I just have not done that. Maybe Mike Gottlieb can comment on that, but all I wanted to mention is that confidentiality is such a huge risk, and that's why the IRB is there. They're there to protect human subjects. And these guidelines, although it would be nice in the most ideal world to achieve every single one of these perfectly, we know, there's no perfect study. And if you do find a perfect study, look at the back on the last page. It's probably sponsored by a drug company or something. But you do your best, and you do your best to report the truth. And the reviewers and the editors want to know that you're not trying to overinflate your findings, that you realize that there are limitations, and maybe people that read it might see an opportunity for a future study, because retrospective chart reviews are kind of on the low end of, as far as like integrity of a study versus like an RCT, but it leads to, hypothesis generating or maybe some other like kind of study. But it's nice to use these frameworks before you to report in your paper, but also just to start your study. Planning should be most of your study, and doing a little bit of pilot is so helpful, because you don't want to go through all this trouble and get the wrong data. And then you also want to make sure you do a little inter-rater reliability. One way to do that is calculate your sample size. And I think there was a study to support to get 10% of whatever your sample size is and have some inter-rater reliability of 2 independent reviewers using your data instrument, and just make sure that you guys are collecting not only the same thing, but what you want to collect for your study.
And so I'll comment 2 things. I'll come to blinding in a second, but as from an editor's lens, transparency is key, as has kind of been mentioned. But one of the most common reasons that we see these, that people end up not hitting all the, the magical 12 or the late 8 or whatever version you're using, is people aren't aware of it. But y'all are here. Yeah, right there. In fact, you can take a picture on your cell phone, and now everyone's aware of it. Most of these are not insurmountable. Even blinding, which is arguably the one that's the most uncommon or one of the more complicated ones, it's not that people don't do it because they can't. It's because we didn't know. And we're human. We just didn't know it. But see, because you're all here, what is now 10 a.m., 10:15 a.m., you all get the inside scoop, so you see this and you can all follow that model. Now, I would, as far as blinding, not every study needs blinding, and sometimes blinding hypothesis doesn't matter, and sometimes it's just a huge waste of effort. But you absolutely can do blinding a few different ways. Sometimes models can involve, where it's like if you a student who is a non-author, that's one model I've seen. So they'll extract the data and step away from it, because they're not. You'll say like, okay, here's the concept of what I want you to pull from it, but I'm not going to tell you the study hypothesis. Or you have them as the delayed author, where they don't get to hear about the study. You just tell them what you're going to extract, and then they get to join in to the writing after they've extracted, so they're blinded to it. The other way I've seen this is separation of concepts. So if you wanted to, for example, see is there a difference between non-invasive ventilation versus mechanical ventilation on mortality, one group extracts non-invasive ventilation mechanical ventilation, a separate group goes in the chart and does mortality, but the two don't look in the other options. So you can separate concepts so they can't actually link them and removes those biases. So there's a few different ways you can do this in practice, and that's the hardest part. Everything else is a little bit easier. And so just knowing about it, being transparent, recognizing if you forget putting your limitations, but if you use your checklist, ideally you should be able to cover them all because these are all doable ones once you know about them in advance.
To add, I think about your team, right? Again, study design, get the people involved. And I think a lot of it is finances, right? Sometimes there's budget. You have to hire another sort of abstractor. That's a cost, right? However, there are different ways of the coin, right? We have a lot of trainees and residents, fellows. Get everyone involved in one aspect of it. But again, adhere to the blinding. That's really the key thing. That makes your paper much stronger so that you can have published in a higher impact journal. That's the ultimate goal. If you can't have some of these barriers, if you do have some of these barriers, at the end, when you do have the manuscript, go over the checklist again. It's actually the things that you did not achieve, unfortunately, you can't achieve all the time. That's your limitation. That's actually good for discussion, actually, right? So that's actually another piece you can think about. Sort of think about how some of the barriers, you make it positive and really address it in your journal article.
Other questions?
Quick addition. Perfect pool of abstractors, high school and college students. People who know nothing about anything. Use them. If they're interested in doing some medical and you've got some kind of medical connections with students, enlist them to be your abstractors. All they need to know is what they're looking for, and then you do your 10%, which is, I'm glad Lynn mentioned that, because that's important. You want to have a big enough sample that you've done everybody, well, both or all your abstractors have done them all, and then you can measure your inter-rater reliability. And if it turns out to be really crappy, well, there's probably something wrong with your data collection abstracting form. So use that also as a sort of a pilot thing. Of course, if you then change your form, you got to go start all over again with the abstraction. Okay.
Other questions? Yeah.
Any pearls of wisdom for working with extracted data sets that are coming from the warehouse behind the EHR?
Yeah, the key is just knowing what the ultimate data warehouse is. Some of them, like NHAMES, everyone kind of knows it. He takes it for granted. Other ones that are evolving, the number of times I've had to explain what the Cosmos database is to reviewers because they are like, no, I don't know what this is. This is not a real database. I recognize that, so I spend more time now in my methods explaining what it is. And so being able to both internally know with this, prove that you can trust the original data, and then be able to explain to the reviewers, because that's the best, that's the best for both making sure you're less likely to get rejected or at least get heavy revisions, but also for the readers. Now, the readers aren't experts in these databases, and a lot of our readers don't subscribe to or have access to these databases, so they trust you as the researcher. They're saying, you tell me what you see. So you have to prove to the reader then that what they're getting out, especially because you're not extracting that much, you're receiving things that have been pre-filtered to prove that it's reliable.
Yeah, I meant your in-house EHR actually.
Oh.
But yeah, that was still helpful. Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There's extracting data from your own in-house electronic medical record, usually Epic. But here we hear about all the different databases that people use, and I've seen so many that I've never heard of. Is there a central depository of these are all the databases that we have that are just emergency medicine based or pediatric based or EMS based, a sub, off of our website?
Yeah, no, good question. Actually, from SAEM perspective, that's a good question. But the answer is no. You just have to learn about different databases out there and really exactly what topic, maybe condition. And there's a lot of data user agreements because there's actually a lot of them are proprietary. Some are public, actually. So it's actually, some of them, but even with public one, you have to apply too. So, there's actually what's called a BioLink, NHLBI has a rich BioLink. It's all the clinical trials data they have to maybe make public, but you have to apply to it, and it's actually peer reviewed for your applications, because they don't want repeated proposals, similar topic, hypothesis to get, and then maybe have to link the teams together to do it as well. So those are the different, some of the nuances, regulation involved with some of the public or private databases out there.
We're at time, but if there was another question, I know you raised your hand at least twice, so.
More of a couple of comments
Yeah.
based on some of the questions. One is that the data abstractors are usually not clinically, they're not doctors, so it's extremely important to look at the code that they've used, or at least speak to them about how they've gotten the variables. There might, for example, be two ways of getting a sodium level that might be a variable, and if they've only looked at one, like the CMP, then they missed out on maybe the I status on that. So it's extremely, don't take for granted that your data abstractor knows, because it's really not clinical. And the second thing I want to say is that, if you're using medical students and people, then you really have to ramp up the training, because in chart reviews, it's not always objective, it's subjective data. Quick example is that if you're looking at clinical signs and symptoms, if someone doesn't mention abdominal tenderness, doesn't mean that they did not have abdominal tenderness, or they didn't check for it.
Right.
So do you mark that as an unknown or as a negative? And these small things can make a big difference when you're doing a multi-center retrospective study.
Yeah, and that last comment relates to missing data and what your plan will be to deal with missing data.
It's just important to monitor your people that are doing this to make sure, they're not kind of doing different things and that everybody understands. Just two quick comments on yours. If you Google RLS Research Learning Series and SAEM, it's usually these webinars with a panel on a certain topic and from like all parts of the country, a few of them, and they did one on database research. And that is a specialty in research in and of itself. And if whatever research passion you have, a lot of it is just like networking and finding those mentors. And you could have mentors from all over the place to help you, and may even share the same specific topic. And then the last thing I want to leave you with, just because it's very difficult to do an interventional study, maybe you want to just check out your new protocol for something, and you're going to need to get consent, and it's just this whole lengthy process. But just consider doing a retrospective chart review of prospectively gathered data that's a lot more cleaner now that we have like Epic and a much easier way to do this. I literally did a chart review on nasotracheal intubation without the EMR. It was like crazy. So just think of maybe doing that, and that will really facilitate your study, make it higher quality, check all those boxes, sort of thing. So, and that's still like a chart review, but a cleaner version of it.
I put the RLS website up for them if they want to see it. So this is not the actual didactic, but anyway, I think we're done. Thank you so much, guys.